Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm honored to present a virtual visitation with award-winning author Alan Orloff. Alan is the author of the new YA novel I Play When on TV, a meta-mystery about an up-and-coming teen actor, Dalton Black, who is sought out by the killer he portrays on a popular crime reenactment show to help prove his alleged innocence. Alan studied engineering and business and had a successful if eclectic career prior to novelist, but true fulfillment didn't come until he began writing fiction. And it turns out the creative life has agreed with him. With multiple books and short stories to his credit, Alan has won 2 international thriller awards, Best ebook original for Pray for the Innocent and Best short story for Rent Due, and a Derringer for the story Dying in Dokesville. Additionally, Alan had a piece selected for inclusion in 2018's The Best American Mystery Stories, edited by Louise Penny. He currently serves as president of the Florida chapter of Mystery Writers of America. Alan's most recent novel marks a foray into the realm of young adult and was inspired in large part by his son's own experiences as an actor. Award-winning author Tom Ryan enthused with snappy dialogue, a high-stakes plot, and a teen actor-turned-detective you'll root for from the first page. I Play When on TV is a YA thriller you won't want to miss. Now, Alan Orloff reveals how he turned a killer premise into one of this summer's most unputdownable reads.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Central Booking. Today I am speaking with Alan Orloff, who is the author of the brand new young adult suspense novel I Play When on TV, which has an incredibly cool cover, if you can see it right there. I even wore a shirt to try to match. But also you were fresh off an International Thriller Writers Award win for your short story Rent Due. So it's a real pleasure to have you on the show. New award, new book, and so much to talk about. Welcome to the show, Alan.
Well, thanks for having me, John. I appreciate it. It's always good to talk to another writer.
You say that now, but it's certainly my pleasure. And I figured, the obvious place to start is to talk about the premise of this new book, I Play When on TV, which we can see over your shoulder on the wall there. So if you can pretend that we are stepping into a virtual elevator quickly and we're taking whoever's watching with us, if you can give us sort of the quick elevator pitch for this book.
Sure. Well, Dalton Black is a teenage thespian who's struggling to make his way in the world of acting. And he has landed this great role on a crime reenactment show where he portrays a murderer as a teenager. And circumstances happen, and the man convicted for the murder is released from prison. And he hunts Dalton down. And of course, Dalton is terrified, and Dalton and his friends have to figure out a way to come to grips with what's happening and figure out the real story behind the event.
Sure. And so before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty details of the book, I did want to ask you, I don't know if you're a plotter, a pantser, or last week I heard the term planter for the first time, which is sort of a combination of the two. But I did want to ask you, what your process is like for taking a promising premise, such as the one that you just outlined, and then developing that into a full-length narrative that actually lives up to the pitch, because this book has a very distinct and compelling premise, which it does live up to, but sometimes I think it must be difficult to come up with that premise and then write a story that actually equates to it. So can you tell us how you flesh that out?
Let me just start with where I got this idea from, because this was an unusual case. My agent at the time, he sent me an email, and I opened it up. It says, Alan, my wife and I, we watch these crime reenactment shows on cable and Investigation Discovery and channels like that. Wouldn't it be cool if a teenage actor portrays a killer as a young guy, and then the murderer gets out of prison and hunts this guy down? And I thought, fabulous premise. It's a fabulous premise. But what my agent did not know at the time was that I had a teenage actor in my family. My son is an actor. And he portrayed a murderer as a young kid on a show called Evil Kin on Investigation Discovery.
Oh, wow.
So this was like, a perfect premise for me. And the great thing was I didn't have to do any research because I lived through this. So it was great. So I saw this premise and I think, all right, well, this is great. I have to add in some twists and turns and so on. So what I typically do is I spend a week or so before I start actually writing, doing some outlining. So you said, people either plotters or pantsers. I'm more of a plotter, but sometimes I'm a plotzer if I get in the way. So I spent about a week doing the plotting, and I do the outlining, but it's not like in grade school where it was, capital Roman numeral 1, subsection A, and so on. I just had like John and Jim are in the coffee shop and they're discussing what to do with the body. I mean, that's my outline for that scene. So I'll spend a week outlining. Sometimes I'll do character sketches for some of the main characters just to get to know them a little bit. And then I'll start writing. And usually I have a deadline. So if it's either a contract or some kind of goal I'm trying to reach, and I'll back it up and I'll divvy it all up, and I write by a daily quota. So if I've got 80,000, my books are typically around 80,000 words. If I've got 2 months, I'll divide it up and I'll come up with 1,200 words a day or 1,500 words a day, and I'll just sit at my computer and I'll just type. And when I hit my quota, I get up. I get up sometimes in the middle of a sentence if I've hit my quota.
Nice.
Things aren't going right. So that's kind of my method. It changes a little bit from book to book, but typically that's how I write.
Sure. That's great. And what a great premise to have delivered to you, and then to realize this is, the perfect idea for you, given your, background. And I did want to ask you a bit more about your son, if you don't mind. But as you mentioned, your son is an up and coming actor, and he's portrayed, child killers in television, which is something that your protagonist, Dalton Black, also does. And I've seen actually on social media you put up some headshots of your son,
right?
Very nice. And then there's one that's a little bit creepy, and you're like, wow, he's very serious and intent right there. So you go from nice smiles to a little bit more chilling. But for people who've been around actors or acting programs, it's a very sort of unique world and unique personalities. So can you talk about how you were able to draw upon your own son's experiences to create that authenticity that runs throughout this book?
Sure. No, that was the cool part, as you mentioned, because I lived this. My son got into acting when he was 8 or 9 years old, and of course, when you're that young, you can't drive yourself to rehearsals or auditions. Your parent has to drive. So I spent a lot of time taking him to auditions and taking him to rehearsals, and of course, I would stick around and watch sometimes from the wings. And the drama kids have a certain energy about them that is just different. They're all extroverts, and I am like a super introvert. So it was very kind of weird, and it felt like I was sort of not, I don't want to say like I was at the zoo, but it was sort of like I was observing sort of different subspecies with all these extroverts just in a room, just going nuts. It was pretty interesting. So I drew a lot upon that. And then he had some professional auditions where he would go. We lived in the DC area, but a lot of the auditions were in Baltimore for like House of Cards was in Baltimore, and some other things they would audition for. So I would drive my son, and it would take maybe with traffic an hour and a half from DC to Baltimore. We'd go into these auditions, and they would take one look at him and say, "Oh, yeah, he's 2 inches too short. Next." And then we'd get back in the car and we'd drive another hour and a half home. And it's just a crazy business. So I tried to use some of those anecdotal things in the book to give it, some verisimilitude, as they say. And hopefully I was successful. My son read the book and gave me some notes. I made some changes, and I think it was a lot of fun to write. Let me put it that way. And I hope it was a lot of fun for people to read.
Yeah, it's so much fun to read, and it's great because you get this really sort of meta mystery, but then you get this whole secondary story about what it's like to be an up-and-coming actor, because it's not all glitz and glamour as a lot of people who have not been in acting, might expect. And I think I told you in an email, but I met my wife. We've been together for a really long time, but she was 16 and she was a theater kid, and she worked in a summer program where they would work with kids and put on a big production. And so that came across as very real, because I remember, meeting her in that situation. I was not a drama kid. Nobody wants to, see me on stage. Nobody wants to see me more than they have to. I was like the introvert, like, wow, these people are wild and very comfortable in their own skin.
Yes.
but it's so palpable in this book, and it took me right back, 19, 20 years, because it's, like I said, it's been that long. But anyway, enough about me. But so anyway, I wanted to come back to Dalton because, as you mentioned, he gets his start and he's portraying an actual convicted killer, Homer Lee Varney, for this TV reenactment program. And then they decide that, it's a compelling case and there's some stuff going on, so they're going to shoot more than one episode. And his, preparation process to play Varney, and also his portrayal of him, inadvertently sort of makes him the star of his own real life drama. So can you talk a little bit about his process leads to this incredible drama?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. He, getting caught up portraying a murderer on the show, and I'm so proud of my son. He was a teenage skinhead, and I'm just so proud of him. It requires, you have to kind of get in the mindset of a murderer, of a killer. And, that can be somewhat unnerving to a teenager. And, once he's in that, then he sort of starts seeing murders coming out of the wings because he sort of got that in his head. And then, oh, is this guy Varney? Is that guy Varney? And, I just thought that would be a sort of a echo of, to have Dalton's journey be sort of similar to kind of the investigation going on many years ago. So probably not a great answer, but
no, it's great. And it's really interesting just because, you don't necessarily think that a young kid is going to have this really involved process to, get into the mind of the person he's playing, but Dalton really does. And then it sort of has some unintended consequences. But I wanted to ask you a bit more about Homer Lee Varney too, if you wouldn't mind. So he is a convicted killer. He's sort of let out on a technicality, and he lives under suspicion. And so you have this character. He is a character in the book. We meet him, we spend time with him, and there's a balance of suspicion and sympathy because he's saying, look, I'm wrongly accused, wrongly convicted, I am innocent. So can you tell us, one, how you balance sort of suspicion and sympathy for his character? And also, is it difficult to maintain that question through the entire length of a novel?
Yeah, well, I think any of us who have been wrongly accused of anything, if it's cutting somebody off in traffic or whatever, I think you feel bad because you don't want people to think ill of you. And, depending on the severity of what it is, it can be, personally cause you stress. And I stay up at night sometimes thinking, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I hope, my actions weren't misinterpreted. So I just can imagine if you were accused of killing someone. That's kind of the worst thing you can be accused of. So I tried to have Varney be sympathetic, but in order to propel the crime story forward, he has to also be kind of suspicious. So I don't want to give too much away, but there's another character who then becomes sort of the boogeyman and the real bad guy. So, it's sort of throughout the book, the first part of the book, Dalton and his friends are suspicious of Varney. And then it sort of takes a twist, and then it's like, well, maybe we should not be so worried about Varney, but about this other character. So that's sort of how I made it last through the whole book, because it was sort of a challenge to come up. In the initial premise, there was no, I kind of had to do with my twist off the initial premise. So it took me a while to figure out a good way to do that.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you too, if you don't mind talking about, social media. It plays really an important role throughout the book. And of course, we're all expected to be on social media now too, and everybody has to have a brand. But can you talk about what you see as being the pros and cons of the medium, and how this is sort of illustrated as the book unfolds?
Well, I'm of a certain age where it's not second nature for me I'm not so facile with all the different technologies and all the different social media avenues. So Facebook I can do, Twitter I can do a little bit. And once start getting to Instagram, I'm a little sketchy. And then anything else beyond that, it's like, what? I have no idea what's going on. So, part of the risk you run when you write a book and you sort of use certain technologies is, even a year from now, it could be obsolete. So I tried to pick, most of what he uses is Twitter, I believe. I'm not sure if I'm so specific about it. I know in my head it was Twitter.
Yeah, it is.
So I figured that one's sort of one it'll stay around for a while. To have a book with teenage protagonists and not to use any kind of social media would be, that wouldn't be right at all. So I used what I could. I try not to make it too much. I try to keep it in real interactions, person on person. But you can't get away. People, the kids are the teenagers are on their phones all the time, as are adults. And to not have that take a part of the story would just be, it just wouldn't be right. So.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Nobody looks up anymore. We're all constantly in our screens, one screen or another. And the interesting thing too is, someone in Dalton's case who is trying to develop a following, social media makes you accessible to your fans, which can be a good thing or not so good, which is interesting to see play out.
And Dalton comments on that throughout a few times. He's like, well, I have to do it, or my manager says that I need to do this, and so on. So he's not, he sort of recognizes some of the pitfalls of social media as well, but it's one of those necessary evils, I suppose, just like being a writer and using it.
Sure. And so I thought I'd ask you too about Dalton's friends, because he spends a considerable amount of time, with his two besties. He has Patch and Trini. And what I love is, it's sort of this organic ensemble cast that's very diverse, but nobody's self-conscious about it, because when you're younger, you're not thinking about who you're friends with and why you're friends with them and what they look like. It's just you have personalities that match and you enjoy each other's company. But I wanted to ask you, one, how you approach, developing secondary characters that really, are full-fledged, multifaceted, aren't just there to propel the plot forward, but are really well-defined people. And also, thinking of Patch and Trini, how their presence in this book provides Dalton some opportunities for self-reflection and growth.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the diversity aspect, and they're not really that self-conscious. Well, I picked that right up from my son's, he and his drama friends. It was just like that, and it's so heartwarming to see that. When I was his age, I'm not sure it was the same mixing bowl as it is that I saw with him. That they have no. Obviously they must recognize the diversity, but there's no change in behavior. There's nothing at all negative. It's all just one big happy family. If you're a drama person, you're a drama person, and let's get on with the show. So I thought that was great. And as far as developing the secondary characters, I think the key is to sort of isolate them individually and have each one have their own separate arc or problems that they're trying to overcome, or challenges or goals that sort of interweave with the broader story. And I hope I was able to do that with Trini and Patch. Some of the, this book went through several rewrites. And as you rewrite it, you sort of change some of the relationships and so on. My very first effort through, Trini had a twin sister.
Wow.
And she was more of a potential love interest for Dalton, and she was not a drama geek. And it just seemed to work better with one fewer character. So I took her out and made Trini a sole, no twin sister. And hopefully the interactions ring true. That was something that, again, being of a certain demographic, I had to get some other people to read and confirm that the dialogue was right and some of the actions were right, and hopefully it came out okay.
Yeah, and well, you can always do a sequel with the evil twin sister, from the back. But let me ask you too, one thing I really enjoyed about the book, and obviously, you have been a parent of teenagers and you have had an actor for a son. You have an actor for a son, but I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about Dalton's parents and the relationship that he has with them, because they also are very distinct characters and each one has a very specific relationship, in a way that they engage or communicate with Dalton that the other might not. And that was something I enjoyed reading. And I'm assuming as a parent, you had some fun, writing those relationships.
I did. And let me first state that, well, in the book, one of the parents is very supportive of Dalton. at pursuing acting as a career. And the other parent is a little less supportive, at least initially. And I want to say that in no way reflects my relationship and my wife's relationship with our son. We were both very supportive. However, we, do think of things, and we do realize how difficult acting is as a career. And wouldn't it be great to have something, plan B, to fall back on? Now, if you look at my career, now I was a numbers guy growing up. I went to school, I became a mechanical engineer. I didn't like engineering. I went back to school and got an MBA. And if you've listened carefully, none of that requires creative writing, right? It wasn't until much, much later that I began my career as a writer. So I am all for pursuing one's interests at a young age, if that's what you really want to do. So back to the story, one of the parents was sort of in that mode. And the other parent was sort of the voice of concern, where Dalton, acting is great, it's fun and all, but maybe you should get a real, take some real classes, go for a real degree in college. Wouldn't it be great to come down to my law firm and see how I do things? And it was fun to write. I have a feeling, seeing a lot of my son's friends and their parents, most of them were supportive, but there were individual cases where it was, okay, enough of this acting stuff, time to wake up and get a job in the real world. And I just thought I would present that in the story.
Sure. And one other thing I wanted to broach quickly, if you don't mind, and you sort of mentioned this a few minutes ago, but when you're writing young adult, when you're writing teen characters, you really have to stay true to their world, because they will be the first people to call you out, and say, that's not right, and you got that wrong. Or like you said, your son gave you some notes that were very helpful. So, you mentioned authentic dialogue and needing to keep up with the technology, but there are some other, sort of unique complications or considerations as well. Parents, curfews, laws that apply to children. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what you found to be the greatest challenges of writing a young adult novel, and then how you were sort of able to circumvent those things while still grounding the story in reality. Because, it's not one of those books where all the adult figures disappear and it's just a bunch of teenagers running around. Like, there are adults in this book and they have expectations of their children.
Right. Yeah, there were a lot of, again, I lived through this. So, and it wasn't that long ago that my son was involved in youth acting. So I remember a lot of the interactions, and, I used the town that he performed in as sort of the model town, as a small town. And so I was able to get a lot of the interactions with like the laws, about teen driving and so on. I was able to get that pretty easily. I think that the toughest part was in some of the dialogue. I would try to use slang, and I would sometimes slip back into, when I was a teenager, we would say certain things, and it just didn't fly. Right. So I had some really good readers who went through and said, you know what, teens don't say this these days. This is no good. This is no good. So I would say it was the dialogue. And I had a kind of a rude awakening when I sent it out and I got back some notes. And I'm like, oh yeah, you know what? I need to really readjust some of my thinking here. So I did change some of the dialogue, and I guess it was harder than I thought it would be going into it to do that.
Sure. And I loved, reading a young adult book where the parents were so involved in other adult figures, because so often in books or movies, everybody sort of conveniently disappears. They're on vacation, they're on a business trip, and kids can run amok and do whatever they want, and nobody's really checking in on them. So I found that to be more believable, because I think it's the more realistic experience that your parents are paying some attention to what you're doing and have expectations of you. So kudos to not
right now. I will say, some of the auditions that I took my son to required an adult to be present until you were, I don't know whether 16 or 18. So I may have bent some of those rules in my, I know I have Dalton going to one audition on his own, kind of a local audition. But yeah, so there's a lot of, the parents are, definitely their parents are involved in the acting world. I mean, they have to be. I mean, yeah, they just are.
Sure.
And that's where you get, the stage parents come about and so on. So.
Right. So if you don't mind, I'm going to sort of move into more general territory, and then I'll ask you a bit about your background. But I also wanted to ask you just about young adult novels in general. They obviously are written for a certain demographic, but they also appeal to a much wider readership. I mean, I read something relatively recently that said something like 25% of people who are purchasing young adult novels are adults who are buying them for themselves. And I know that I still love to read, young adult, and I'm not a young adult anymore. As hard as that is to admit, I think I've not been one as long as I was one now. But, can you talk about the genre's cross appeal? And then if there's anything you think in this book that might specifically appeal to your adult readers in addition to the younger readers it's going to draw in?
Yeah, I thought a lot. I've thought a lot about that over the years, because you're right. There is a significant portion of readers of YA books are adults, and I think it harkens back to, at least for me, I did a lot of reading as a kid, a lot of YA reading, and I sort of found I seem to have developed stronger attachments to the books and to the characters when I was a teen than in later years. So I think people like to experience those years again, sort of, by reading some of the YA stuff. And a lot of parents, are parents of YA teens and so on. So, they can also read books that sort of pertain or to their children's peers, so on, if you will. What was the rest of the question?
Oh, actually, I think you probably addressed it, because we, talked a bit about the adult characters already and how their dynamic is in the story. So I guess adults would realize, what they might relate to in this book. But to your point, I think it's very true. I find that when I'm reading young adult, it sort of does take me back to my earlier, reading experiences. And I did, form stronger attachments to characters and maybe even authors then. And I don't know if I realized that until you said it, but I've read a lot of young adult this summer, and it really has taken me back to sort of the books that were my first loves. So there's sort of that nostalgia factor. So
right, I think so. And now I remember what the rest of the question is. The appeal, I think, and you mentioned this earlier, that the drama aspect of the book, a lot of people have gone through drama programs. And again, it's a very special time because you form really close bonds with the other kids. Putting on a play is sort of like, akin to being on a sports team. And you really, it's like, quite an effort. There's a lot of time involved. It's an emotional experience generally, and you form really close bonds. And I think a lot of the people that have come through the acting programs will like this book, because it brings them back, like you said, to the time when they did it. It's like, oh yeah, I remember coming in on Saturday and working on sets, and I remember having paint fights and everything else that goes on. So I think that, again, it's sort of a brings you back to good old times kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was telling my wife, like, I think you should read this book because, she had that experience and I was on the periphery of it totally. Like, I was the secondary character. But yeah, I think that anybody who's experienced that is going to read this and be brought right back into that world, because I felt like I was brought back to watching people in that world. So very interesting. And so if you don't mind, I did want to ask you about your background. You already shared a bit that, you come from a very different background. You studied engineering, business, had a multitude of jobs before you came to writing. So I'm wondering if you could tell us, what inspired the eventual transition to becoming a full-time writer, and how do you see that as sort of balancing out, the other careers that you had that weren't maybe as fulfilling?
Yeah, it's I like you said, I was an engineer, worked for a while, went back to school, worked for a while, and never ever did I ever dream that I would be doing any creative writing. Now in the 90s, I started a newsletter company, so I was doing some nonfiction type writing, and I didn't hate it. I thought it wasn't bad. So in the early 2000s, I've always been a big reader, and I think that's what's kind of led me down this path. I was a huge reader. Back in high school, I didn't really read the stuff we were supposed to read, all the so-called classics, James Joyce and William Faulkner. That was like, I don't even know what language they're speaking. So I would read Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov, and later Stephen King and Dean Koontz. And I mean, I was big into all that stuff. And then I kept on reading. And when I was in my 20s, I had a boss worked for in Boston, and he said, "Alan, do you like to read?" I said, "Yeah, I sure do. Have you ever read the Spencer series?" I'm like, "No, it sounds good." So I read all the Spencer books, like that. Love Spencer. And then from there, I just, it opened up the whole world of reading crime fiction.
Right.
But I was always a reader. And then I don't know what happened one day. And when I said to my wife, I think I want to try writing. And she's like, what? And then, creative writing, short stories, novels. And she fainted, and I revived her. I said, yeah, let me give it a try. So I wrote some short stories, and they didn't suck. I took an adult ed class at the local high school, and part of the assignment was writing a short story, and it didn't suck. And the instructors gave me some encouragement. Said, Alan, this is good. You need to take out the 50 or 60 semicolons in the first 2 pages. But aside from that, you got a good start. So I took that course. I took more workshops, and I kept working at it, and so on. And finally, I got an agent, and the first agent, it was my 4th manuscript that I had written, or 3rd or 4th manuscript that I had written, 4th manuscript I had written. And I managed to get this agent, and he shopped it around, and it didn't sell. And then I got the idea that he wanted to concentrate on nonfiction because he said, Alan, I want to concentrate on nonfiction. Do you write any? And I said, no, I'm sorry. So I went back to the query pool, which is a demoralizing exercise. And I got another agent, and she managed to sell my first book, which was Diamonds for the Dead, which was the 5th manuscript that I had actually written. So it was a long journey, sort of, most of which had nothing to do with writing. But I think that all the life experiences that I accumulated over the years contributed to my ability to come up with stories. Because, if I had started writing when I was 22 or 23, what would I write about? I don't know. Now I got lots of stuff to write about. So,
Sure. Yeah, that's very interesting. And like you said too, I think reading is, so important because it teaches you all about story and structure, and you might not even realize at the time, what you're learning, but then you have that background and your life experiences, which is pretty terrific. And so, when people ask me, where's my book? I just keep telling them, I'm researching. All this reading is for research.
There you go.
But let me ask you too, you have been self-published, you have done traditional publishing, and now you sort of do both, which I think is terrific. I mean, I think that there are so many opportunities available to authors now where you can really create your own hybrid model of how you get your books into the hands of readers. So let me ask you, what considerations do you make when deciding what outlet you want to use for a specific book? And what words of guidance might you offer to other people who are sort of pondering their own publication options?
I think a lot depends on what your goals are. And for me, I published my first 3 books with Midnight Ink, which is traditionally published. And then I had written a horror novel called The Taste, which I thought was so much fun to write. I thought it really came out great. But my agent at the time did not really know the horror market. So it didn't really, she shopped it a couple places, but it didn't really take off. And this was back a while when self-publishing, you read the stories about all these self-publishers just selling thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of books. So I thought, all right, well, it doesn't really fit with my crime fiction stuff. So why don't I try to self-publish this? So I self-published it, and it sold maybe 20 copies, I don't know. And it didn't take off. So I had a couple other manuscripts that, for whatever reason, did not make it out into the real world. And I thought, all right, well, let me give it another try. And I tried the second time, and wasn't any much better. And I tried another time, and I did get a lot of downloads on the third book that I self-published, but I didn't enjoy the process. I didn't like having to do all the marketing and all the formatting and all the everything else. So I much prefer, this is just personal, I much prefer the traditional publishing route. Now, just recently, I've gotten my rights back from Midnight Ink, which has stopped publishing books. Right. And I am going to reissue those. I guess technically that, I mean, it's self-publishing, I guess, because it's me doing it. So I've hired someone to do the new covers, and those should be out actually in the next few months. And I'm gonna, while I'm at it, I'm gonna kind of consolidate my brand a little bit and reissue some of the self-published books. So technically I am also, I'm a hybrid publisher, but hopefully my future books will be traditionally published. That's just me though.
Sure. And can I ask you too, just to stick with that for a moment, I mean, self-publishing, is much more, I think, viewed as legitimate now, whereas, a decade or so ago, people didn't really understand it. People would say, well, your formatting's bad, your cover is not good, things like that were really detracting from the name of self-publishing. But it is a viable option now. So for people who choose that path, since you've experienced it yourself, can you just briefly, speak to them and tell them what might be some of the things that they want to consider for best practices if they are going to put out their own book?
Sure. Well, it needs to appear perfect. I mean, you have to have an excellent cover, and you shouldn't do it yourself unless you are a certified, graphic artist that has done covers before. The interior formatting needs to be perfectly done, and you can hire people at a reasonable cost to do all this stuff for you. Right. The discoverability is the issue that you probably have the toughest time with, because if you do your homework and you hire the right people, you can produce a really nice looking book. But the trick is to get it into the readers' minds and then into their hands. And if you're a great marketer, or if you're really adept at social media, you have a leg up on that. It takes a lot of time, and you need to wear different hats. Like the hat of the writer is one, you're alone in your den, your cave, typing on your computer, the things that come into your head. It's a completely different skill set to go out into the world and try to peddle your book, or do the artwork or the graphics or whatever. So if that appeals to you, then you'll have a leg up on some of the other publishers, writers doing that.
Sure. And it's funny that so many people think, oh, I've written the book and now the work is done, and it's like, oh, the work has just begun.
Yeah, writing the book is in many respects the easy part of it. It's and many people, I mean, if your goal is, if you don't have a goal of selling a lot of books, or being eligible for a lot of the big awards or whatever, self-publishing is you don't have to wait 15 months or 2 years to get your book on the shelf. You don't have to go through gatekeepers writing is very subjective. And a great book might not get discovered, your agent may not like it, or editors might not like it, but it's still, the readers, it may resonate with the readers. So you can sort of skip some of those intermediate steps.
Right.
But you need to approach it as a serious project, or you won't be able to compete successfully.
Sure. All right. A couple more questions and I'll let you get back to it. But I did want to ask you too, some people write short stories, some people write novels. You write both, and you've had, real success sort of in both arenas. So I wanted to ask you, in thinking of the forms, for a short story or novel, how are they similar? How are they different? And do you have a preference between the two, or is really just a consequence of the story that you're hoping to tell?
Wow. When I started, again, when I just decided, hey, I want to start writing, I wrote some short stories just to kind of what they call, proof of concept. Can I sit down and type out something and hit the end on a piece of writing? And I could. But I had always thought going into it that I only wanted to write novels, that my mind, worked in novel length arcs. The story ideas I had were big enough for novels. So I did not write a short story that I intended to send out for, try to get published until probably I'd written 4 or 5, 6 full manuscripts.
Wow.
And then I looked around and I saw my friends, my writer friends, writing these stories and submitting them and getting in these publications and anthologies and in magazines. And I'm like, hey, that's pretty cool, because, it's pretty hard to get something published, pretty hard to get a book published. And then you have to wait 2 years to see it. But the short time frame of writing a short story, I mean, they are a lot shorter than novels. They take less time generally. And then sending it out, you wait a couple months, and then it'll show up maybe a month or 2 later in a publication or whatever. But the feedback loop is a lot quicker. And it's nice to get that affirmation that what you're writing, hey, it's pretty good. Somebody wants to read it. Somebody wants to buy it, and then somebody wants to read it. So I started writing some short stories, and I was, as you said, I was lucky enough to have them accepted in a lot of places. I'm like, this is pretty cool. So I sort of fill in the time that I'm not working on a novel with short stories. And then you get, after you do it for a while, there's the calls that come out for certain publications that you've been in before and you like to be in again. And it's really fun for me to be in an anthology with other writers. It's like sort of being on a baseball team. You got 9 or 10 or 12, whatever, other people that you can, collaborate with, do events with, interact on social media with. Hey, we're part of this anthology. It's really great, and you get your stories in there with other writers. Some are like super big names you can be in publications with. And I thought it was really, really cool. So as far as the form itself, it's different. In a novel, you've got a lot of space for, subplots and a lot of characters and a lot of twists and turns, because you have to fill up 80,000 words worth, right? 300 pages, whatever. In a short story, it's more like you just have room to examine one thing. So it might be a character quirk. It might be, you might have a cool twist in a plot. And I thought that appealed to me. And something else that you can do in a short story is you can have unlikable protagonists. Now, there are lots of books out there that have, novels that have unlikable protagonists. I don't want to be stuck writing, it takes me, 6 weeks to write a book? No, it takes a lot longer than that. I don't want to be stuck writing an unlikable protagonist for a year and then editing him or her and so on. I want my characters to be likable. I have readers and have my readers like them. But in short stories, you can have, the story of a criminal, or I write a lot of noir stories where bad things happen to bad people. And it's a lot of fun, and you can use different techniques, different styles. So you can experiment a lot with short stories, which I find very appealing.
Sure. And I wanted to give you an opportunity, to throw in a plug for Mystery Writers of America quickly, because you talked about, the many hats that authors wear. And you, some people probably know, are president of the Florida chapter. So for people who are looking to really build and develop a community, how would Mystery Writers of America possibly benefit them if they're not already a member?
Yeah, Mystery Writers of America is the preeminent organization for crime fiction writers, crime writers in the country. And it's divvied up into a bunch of different chapters. And we have, it's a fantastic place to network with other writers. Our chapter and most of the chapters have monthly meetings where there's generally a guest speaker, and they talk about either craft or forensics, or we have, subject matter experts come in, cadaver dogs or whatever, come in and talk to the group. And you can really learn about writing, about different aspects of making sure that the facts you use in your stories are accurate. But networking is great. You can find out some of those anthologies. People talk about them at the meetings. Oh yeah, we're thinking about doing this. Are you interested? Would you like to write a story for or this anthology we're working on, or we're going to have a group event at the so-and-so library, are you available? So it's a great way to learn about craft, but also learn about the business of being published and promoting and marketing. And there are other benefits. There's a monthly newsletter that comes out. There's a mentor program. The MWA sponsors the Edgar Awards, which are fun to do. They co-sponsor various other mystery conferences around the country. So it's a great organization. There's another organization, Sisters in Crime, which is a similar type organization that I encourage every writer out there who's writing crime fiction to, if you're not a member now, to consider becoming a member of one or both of these organizations. They're really great.
Yeah, terrific. And I often say, and this is somewhat surprising to people who don't know the community, but the crime community by and large is incredibly supportive and generous, enthusiastic, and really, lifting people up. Nobody's concerned with just themselves. It's how can we help the community at large? And I think that that's a terrific, wonderful thing.
You are absolutely right, John. I come from, corporate America, so on, where it's kind of a zero-sum game in many respects. If you don't get the contract, your competitor gets a contract, then you're out on. But in writing, if a reader reads a book and likes it, they're going to read another book and another book. You read a lot of books, so I don't think crime fiction writers consider themselves to be competing with other writers at all.
Right.
They are so supportive. I have met so many people who are willing to blurb my books or give me advice or look at my work or whatever. It's just amazing, and that's maybe the best thing about being a crime fiction writer is you get to meet all these generous people that are so interesting.
Yeah, it's terrific. And everybody's sort of like, you win, I win, everybody wins, which is a great spirit to have. All right, last two questions for you. Of course, I have to ask you for your advice because we always do that. So in terms of a creative or writing life, what is the best advice that you think you've ever gotten? And then the best advice that you never got but had to learn for yourself throughout the process of becoming a writer?
I think that the best advice is advice that I now give to writers, aspiring writers who just can't seem to get something done. And that's to sit your butt in your chair. I call it Big Fock, butt in chair, fingers on keyboard. If you want to write a novel, you have to sit down and write your novel. Okay. You can't be doing research for months and months and months and not actually writing a novel. You can't be thinking about your novel. You can't be talking about your novel. You got to sit your butt down and you got to type. And I think the biggest thing you can do, the best thing you can do if you're having trouble finishing something is get something done. It can be the crappiest thing in the world. And goodness knows my first drafts are really, really crappy. But they're done. They're 80,000 words. And then I can go back. Once I'm done, then it's like, okay, now I can go make this readable. Right. I'll change the character's name in the 3rd chapter and again in the 7th chapter. And I don't go back and change it while I'm writing. I wait till I'm done because then you can see what the whole story looks like. Right. And so that would be the advice I have to people. If you're having trouble getting something done, don't keep rewriting the first chapter over and over and over again. Just sit down and just type from point A to the end and then go back and look at it. Sure. Then you'll have, you have that sense of satisfaction. I wrote 80,000 words. Yeah, they suck, but they're done. Okay. And I think the advice that I wish I had gotten, that it took me a while to really understand, was, and maybe it's not advice, but it's just sort of reality, how subjective writing really is. And I guess, it sounds stupid, right? Well, of course, Alan, it's subjective. You should have known that back when you were 15 years old. Some people like some books and some people don't like other books. But I'd never really thought about it in terms of when I produce something, or when I read something that maybe a friend produces, or I read something that somebody I hear about has written that says, oh, this is great. And I read it and I'm like, I wouldn't say it was great, it was okay. But it just fascinates me how certain books, certain writers are perceived in different ways. And I'll just say, you know, William Shakespeare, a lot of people like that guy. I just it doesn't I just can't get into it. So I don't know what that makes me, but
I think we're in the same boat there. I never found him to be a page turner.
no, but a lot of people, you know, just love him, love his
Absolutely.
work, and so yeah.
Fair enough. All right, last question. You know, since we talked about I Play One on TV, which just came out, can you give us a little teaser of what readers might expect next from you?
Well, I have a couple of novels that are in various stages of being submitted or being reviewed, but nothing is set novel-wise. Now, I have a few short stories that are scheduled for publication. I have in the Malice Domestic anthology called Mystery Most Diabolical, I have a 25-stanza limerick that's coming out, which is interesting. And I have a story in the BoucherCon anthology, This Time for Sure, I think it's called, and that should be out next month in conjunction with the BoucherCon Mystery Conference convention. And I have a story in an anthology called Murder by the Glass, and my story is called A Taste of Murder. And that was a lot of fun to write. I've written a series of books, a series of short stories, excuse me. I think I've written 3 where I introduced a lot of wordplay, like a lot of word puns. And the first 2 were totally food-based word puns. And the theme of the anthology is wine, so these are wine-based food puns. So that was a lot of fun to write. And I've got a couple of, I have a few stories coming out next year as well. So it's mostly on the horizon right now. It's short stories. And of course, I'll be talking about I Play One on TV for a while too.
Sure. Oh, I was going to say, man, I love puns. Good puns, bad puns, mediocre puns. I'm all
Right.
about it. But in the
Right.
meantime, as people wait for those stories to drop, they can pick up I Play One on TV, which is a great way to spend a summer night. So, Alan Orloff, thank you so much. This was a real pleasure. I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
I look forward to the day. You take care.
You too.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.